This is approximately an hour-long webinar about law firm compensation systems. So thanks for joining me. I'm Gary Allen, the founder of Lean Law. Happy to have everybody on board today. We'll give everybody just a minute to sign in. I see that people are coming in as we speak. So I can just get started with some background items. I'm going to go directly through the presentation today. But if you've got questions, we should have time at the end. The presentation is going to take roughly 45 minutes, and we'll have time after that for questions, or we might let you go a little early if we don't have too many. Last time we did this webinar, we had a ton. So I'm expecting we'll have more today. And so just put those in Q&A. We have disabled the chat, so you can't use that. So please use the Q&A for your questions. Allison is going to be helping me here, so she'll notify me if anything significant comes up as we're doing the webinar. I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. Again, I'm Gary Allen. I've been a practicing attorney in a mid-sized firm in Boise, Idaho for about 35 years. I just retired in February. The reason that I am not off climbing a mountain somewhere is because I experienced a lot of pain from bad business practices during the course of my career, especially early in my career. I had a couple of firms blow up while I was with them. And I was fortunate to land after the second one of those events with a really well-run firm. And I spent 30 years with that firm. And that's given me a passion to help law firms, make law firms into better businesses, and particularly to improve their financial performance, because that made me a lot happier as a lawyer to be in an efficient firm. And I want to help other people achieve that as well, because it's no fun to be in a poorly run law firm. Along the way, I founded Lean Law, which, as some of you know, I know we've got a number of Lean Law's existing customers on the webinar today. It's a legal billing software company. And we think it's really a critical part of helping you to achieve those financial results that you want, although it's not the only thing, as we're going to talk about today. So here's what we're going to understand and cover today. I want to do some background that's going to take maybe 10, 15 minutes about key financial metrics that separate a best-in-class financial performance from average performance. And then I want to talk about what I call the 6 pillars of a best-in-class mid-sized financial performance in a firm. And then with that context, I think that the value of an objective compensation system and the right type of values and things in your compensation system will make a lot more sense, especially as we're focused today on keeping your best people. So that's where we're headed. So just to put this in the context of retaining legal talent, here are the factors based on my experience that are most important in keeping talent in your firm. And obviously, money is an important part of that. And I've repeated it here several times to kind of reinforce that point. It's not the only thing, but people expect professional development. They expect a positive culture. They expect flexibility. They expect good communication, all those human factors that play in. But, how they are compensated and how they feel about it is a huge part of being in a law firm. Being a lawyer is really difficult. And, you work really hard, and you do not need any layers of BS layered on top of that. So that's what we're trying to peel that away, create a compensation system that meets those financial needs without a lot of extra stuff. So now let's talk about this background of good financial performance in a law firm. So how do law firms make money? Fortunately, since lawyers are not necessarily numbers people, it's pretty darn simple. It's really your overhead minus, or your revenue minus your overhead equals your profit. So, your overhead, of course, is just your expenses. We'll get into that, how we define that a little bit here. And then there are 5 elements of that profit. One is the capacity. How much can you bill? Uh, uh, how much of that is utilized? That's utilization. Realization, how much of that is billed? How much of that amount is collected, and then your overhead as a percentage of revenue. And I'm going to talk about each of those in more detail here on the coming slides. So what's at stake with that profitability? And I want to put this in the context of 2 different law firms. The lawyers are identical. They each bill the same amount they say they bill $500,000 a year. There are 10 lawyers in the firm. One of these firms is average on these key metrics. And, it's kind of hard to find good data about how law firm performance, but this is the best, as I understand it, out there. And the other firm is going to be a top performer. And I've know firms that are top performers. I worked in a firm that's a top performer and met these criteria. So I know it can be done. So what's the difference between an average firm and a top performing financial mid-sized law firm? So let's talk about capacity. And in this case, we have a whole different discussion about how to increase the capacity, how to work more and decrease the hours that it takes to do that. But for today's discussion, we're just going to assume that the capacity is the same between these firms. So moving to utilization, so we've got, again, potential revenue, 500,000 times 10 lawyers, $5 million in potential revenue. In a top performing firm, you're going to hit, say, 95% of that or better. In an average firm, maybe 90%, and it could be much worse. So for your billable time, which is the potential times the utilization percentage, is 4.75 in your top performing firm, you've already created a gap of 250,000 with that average performing firm at 4.5 million. All right, now that's how much time people worked on client matters. How much are they able to bill? And I've billed clients for over 30 years. Lots of reasons you're not able to bill all that time. But if you, have a top performing firm, again, should be about 95% there. An average performer, let's say that's 90%. Again, could be much lower than that. Now it's the difference is $500,000 that you've opened up, 4.5 to 4 million. Collection. Now this is your build time times your realization percentage. Again, 95%. My firm typically hit 97, 98%, but 95 is still very good. 90% for an average performer. Again, I've seen much worse than this. I've heard firms bragging about percentages in the 80s. So now you've created another gap. So on the revenue side of things, you now have a significant gap between these firms. Now overhead expense is where you can see enormous gaps between firms, and this has kind of been one of my favorite stalking horses over the years. So now you take your gross revenue and you calculate your overhead as a percentage of revenue. So overhead in absolute isn't very meaningful, because if you're producing $1 million a year in overhead or in revenue, and you have $200,000 in overhead, 20%, nobody's really going to notice that. It's not an issue. But if you produce $300,000 a year in revenue per lawyer, and you have 200,000 in overhead against that, that's a huge deal. So the best way to measure all of that is your overhead as a percentage of revenue. A top performing firm is going to be somewhere between 20 and 30%. For years, my firm was around 30. The last few years, they've been able to hit 20, which amazes me. An average firm, and I looked and looked for good numbers here, 45 to 50%. And so call in 50% the average to make the math easier. So now we've opened up a huge gap between these firms, 3.2 million to 1.8 million. And let me say one thing about what we're counting as overhead here. So these are just the expenses outside of any compensation to the billers, whether they're associates or partners or whatever. That's considered to be part of the profit. So all we're talking about is staff expense, building expense, all those outside expenses, the people who actually do the work and get paid for it, that's in the profit component here. So that's how we're calculating overhead. And I think even with that, you have an average of 50% out there in the marketplace. So now we've opened up this enormous gap between the top performing firm and the average performing firm. So let's look at what that really means in the course of a lawyer's life. So in the top performing firm, 3.2 million in profit to distribute among those 10 lawyers. Average performing firm, 1.8. So that's 3.9 million or 1.39 million for the firm, $139,000 a year per lawyer, which is what you're giving up by not having, by being just an average performing firm as opposed to a top performer. Now, if you really want to cry in your beer, you can look at this over the course of a 40-year legal career. And for a lawyer, that adds up to over $5 million that you've left on the table. So, just take a minute and look at that number and ask yourself, if there's anybody listening to this who can afford to leave $5 million on the table over the course of their career. I thank goodness that I didn't. So, that's really what's at stake in the financial performance here. So what's really the difference between these firms? And the difference is entirely leadership and management. The lawyers at large, and frankly, most of the ones who are managing partners, really want to practice law and really want to focus on the top line. I remember very well when I was a young associate, I worked in a mid-size 150 lawyer firm in San Diego, and they were transparent with their overhead, and I was shocked and went to my supervising partner and said, wow, we need to do something about this, because it was well over $200,000 in 1990 overhead per lawyer. And I was told, overhead's too hard, focused on revenue. And, I think that's sort of endemic through the industry, that it's deemed to be too hard. But there is a lot of, as you see, a lot of money to be made by focusing on real efficiency. So the leaders, those of you who are, managing partners, lawyers need to lead, and the managers, you're creating this bottom line, whether you do it intentionally or just allow things to happen as they've been happening. So does this difference matter? And I want to say this from the standpoint of somebody who's lived both sides. And I would say it's made all the difference. I don't think I would have continued practicing law if I had not wound up in a really well-run firm. It gives you more freedom as a lawyer. You're going to have a happier practice with happier clients because you won't feel the billing pressure in the same way. And obviously, very different type of retirement that you might experience in a good firm, in a well-run firm compared to an average firm. Same with the managers out there. It's going to be more satisfying. You'll have a better work environment and a very different understanding of your value. So I guess I'm here, pounding my shoe on the table saying this is, something really important that you need to think about, and figure out how you're going to get to that top performing tier, and change the trajectory of your career and your firm. So we put together a little report card that you'll be able to download after the webinar that can tell you where you stand on these metrics. And there's some simple things to fill out, and it's going to give you a grade between an A and an F on each one of these things. I grade pretty hard, so don't expect to get great results. If there's anybody who gets an A, I'd love to hear about it. And learn more about how you're running your firm so well. But I encourage you to fill this out and ask, what does it tell you about your strategy? And we actually have a second tab in here that allows you to focus on strategies to improve each one of these things. To get right to the bottom line, this right here, we got 51% profit relative to your capacity. That's really your goal line here. If you can hit that, my experience tells you you're going to be much happier lawyer, much happier law firm. All right, so now just one more piece of background, which is, when we're talking about creating best-in-class financial performance, you've got, that efficient, we've really just been talking about efficient operations. There are really 6 things, I think, that define what that means. And I think that's going to help, because one of them is this objective compensation system, but it fits within a context of a number of things that law firms have to do to really hit first-in-class financial performance. You need an accountable culture. You need efficient operations, like I've been talking about, in terms of overhead, in terms of technology. Technology is, what we do at Lean Law, but technology is, actually, it's kind of a nice to have in many ways. It'd be difficult not to have decent technology these days and hit those numbers. But my firm's been hitting those numbers since the 80s, when there really wasn't much available in terms of technology. You need to really think about tailoring your product. You need the right kind of marketing for the markets that you're in. And you need a clear succession plan, because good people are not going to stay in a firm that's going to end with its founder. So those are, that's the big picture. Now let's focus on one factor of that today, which is the objective compensation system. And I'm just, waving my flag here with my bias that this is absolutely the best model for law firms to adopt. So the first thing that I want to say here is, when you're talking about lawyer compensation, cash is king. First, the firm itself should be maintaining cash reserves and not, relying on debt to get through the year, through the first quarter, however you're doing it. But have the discipline to say, nope, we're going to be able to, we're going to survive as a cash business. It's a professional service business where you don't have a lot of investments that you need to make, like a manufacturing business. You should be able to survive on your cash. Second thing is, don't compensate partners based on billings. You're just asking for trouble. You are socializing risk and privatizing profit if you do that. It's much, much better if the lawyers who are responsible and are going to make the money based on the client have to actually, are actually incentivized to bring that compensation and that revenue in from the client, so that doesn't fall to the firm. I don't believe in partner salaries. I think that, partners are by their nature, they're the risk takers in the firm. So they shouldn't receive any sort of guaranteed compensation out of the firm. It should be part of the firm profit. You can give them a draw against either prior money that they brought in. That's their money. They should be able to do that. And as I think it's even reasonable to allow negative draws and allow people to borrow some money against the firm's cash reserves, as a kind of a softener against the hardness of an objective system otherwise. And, when you do take risk as a firm, like if you give your associates a salary, there's a risk premium there, which should be accounted for in what you pay. And I think the more that is transparent, the better. It's like, no, you don't get the same salary as an associate as you would for the same production as a partner because you're not taking the risk. So I think those are all, reasonable things to get your firm on a really solid basis out of the gate, and make it work as a cash business. That takes away a lot of risk and worry that everybody's going to have in the law firm otherwise. Then I want to kind of step back and say, okay, we're talking about money here, but money only really works as an incentive if it's grounded in your values. And that's really important to, understand why, what are the kinds of things that create comfort and safety for people in a firm about money, and what makes them nervous. And based on my life, there are 3 values that support every great compensation model. They're trust. I mean, you must have trust among your partners. A saying in my firm was that rule number 1 is you choose your partners carefully, but you also don't want to have to be looking over their shoulder. Gee, are they producing enough? And how are they being compensated next to me? So that building that trust among them is really important. Fairness. People have to feel like they're being treated fairly relative to other people. And then finally, accountability. Like, again, it's like, I don't want to have to be worrying about what my partner next door is doing, because that might affect how I'm compensated for what I bring to the firm. You really don't need to have that if you've got a good compensation model, and it feeds back to that value. I want to just talk for a minute about models that I think are failures. I think lockstep, where people are paid based on their longevity and equity only, is a failed system. That and we'll talk a lot more about why that is, but it's too rigid. It does not value performance. It only values longevity. So that doesn't work anymore, in my opinion. I don't like compensation committees. I think that creates a lot of suspicion and politicking within the firms where I've seen that done. So, you may be using a lot of the same factors in a compensation committee, but is it really, producing anything more than just passing on the numbers to people would? Anarchy is a bad system. That's where you have maybe a strong managing partner who's negotiating deals with everybody and negotiating salaries, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. I have not seen that work well, and you can't get any scale with a system like that. And then finally, there's bureaucracy, which might be have the a foundation of a good objective system, but it's gotten so complicated that nobody really remembers why things were done, and there were special deals done for A and B and C, and it it loses its meaning. So I will talk about that a little bit more, but you've got to have that connection back to the values and the feelings that people have around compensation, or you're not going to succeed. So what are the factors in a good objective model? We have the Boston firm of Hale and Dorr to thank for having thought of the basic system here. They call it the finder, minder, and grinder system. So you compensate the person who originated the client. Obviously, they have a lot to do with the success of the firm. Making rain is important. The minder is the person who manages the firm. That can be very important if you have maybe some very large clients, especially, and that may require compensation. And the grinder, the person who actually does the work that the client pays for. So those are the main things. There are other factors I think many firms fit in as well. One is you pay people for management, right? Maybe as a salary or a percentage or something like that. You may pay people for certain marketing or intangible things that they do in a firm. In my firm, that was just considered what you had to do in order to bring your own clients and be successful, but you could make a different decision about that. And then finally, the longevity and equity that can get lost if you don't have a strong founder, or if a founder retires. So nobody to stand up and say, hey, I worked really hard to build all of this and the goodwill and the systems that we have. There should be some ongoing compensation for that. So those are basically the 5 things that are compensated in most law firms. Even in a compensation committee situation, these are the basic factors. So for a typical factor weights, and these can go all over the place, because if there are 10 different law firms, there are 11 different ways of doing things. But this is not unusual for what we see. Maybe origination percentage of 10%, responsible 5%, working 75%, contribution to equity 10%, and management comp. The reason I put this at $250 an hour is there's a big opportunity cost for somebody who goes into management, right? You could hire a manager for less than that, at least in a smaller firm. But if you're going to have a lawyer manager, or at least a lawyer leader, you generally are going to have to compensate them a little bit higher, because they're giving up the opportunity to bill hours and manage a practice. And then the total overhead, again, I said, all right, we've got 50% of revenue here. That's pretty high for this example. Ideal is 30% or less. I want to make a pitch here for simplicity, and this is both as the Lean Law founder and as a practicing lawyer. I think if you can figure out how to do this in a relatively simple way, that is, and a relatively accepted way, then that is going to make things a lot easier for everybody. Number one, it can help tie you more clearly back to the why of why you're doing it. This is about trust, fairness, and accountability. And you want people to feel that very easily when they're working and when they see what they're going to get paid, without having to do any advanced calculus to figure out what their number is at the end of all of that. The other thing is that complexity can be divisive among your partners. It's like, well, that was just a deal we made for somebody to give this extra percentage for responsible something or other, or referral fee, or whatever it is. People kind of get lost in the they get down in the weeds about things like that, and ask yourself if making those kind of special deals really serves your values. Then finally, complexity is expensive. We've worked really hard at Lean Law to try and create a good objective compensation tracker and distribution of those funds. But there is no way we can accommodate every way that every law firm is going to calculate their compensation. So, and nor us, nor anybody. We don't know of anybody in the market who can really do that. And so what you wind up with is a lot of complicated spreadsheets that are expensive to manage. And, that costs money. If that costs you $50,000 a year to maintain your compensation spreadsheet, do you really have the value of, you're really getting the value out of that you want? All right, so we're here to talk about how to keep your best people. So what I did is I put together these personas of people who or people you want to keep in most law firms. So let's go through those. I'm really curious if anybody has any others, but I think these are the main ones. So you've got a founder persona. We call him Horace. So he's very professionally accomplished. He, has values, traditions, in large part because he created them for the firm. He put his heart and soul into building the firm. So he's going to value that equity component. He's probably going to value origination a lot because he probably, he might have his fingerprints on a whole bunch of clients in the firm. And he's probably going to be, depending on where the firm is coming from, he may be the hardest one to accommodate when it comes to an objective system. But if he wants to practice with other people and not alone, he may have to make some accommodations himself. Atticus here is the persona of a managing partner, a younger managing partner, who is also trying to balance a law practice. Pretty stressed out. He really just would rather be practicing law, and is a little resentful of how he's compensated relative to for his management duties and what he's giving up in his practice. You have Julia here, I think, is really the key persona in the whole thing, which is she's the young, very successful partner. So she's now coming into her own as a rainmaker. If you're in a lockstep system, she's not compensated very well. She may have concerns about, is she really respected in the firm? And she's a hot commodity in the marketplace if she wants to move somewhere else. So, if you want to keep the future of your firm, you've got to focus on you got to be able to accommodate people like Julia. Francesca is another interesting one. I call her a lifestyle partner. I don't like that term particularly. I don't have a better one. She's very talented. She wants to, she's probably has a family or other interests. She wants to stay in the game, as I've heard it said, in that part of her life, and ramp up her practice later on. So there's some long-term value in lawyers like Francesca, which are hard to accommodate under, a rigid full-time system, a salary system, and a lockstep system, as you'll see. So, how do you keep her around and take advantage of the value that she creates? Then you've got the next generation of great lawyers. So you've got somebody like Marvin here, who is a really talented, hardworking associate. He may be on a salary and, working a lot harder than somebody else who is also getting the same salary. So how do you accommodate somebody like Marvin and let them grow while you know, recognizing they're not taking risk, and, you know, other factors that you've got to balance here. Then you may have people like Glenda, and she's a paralegal in this example, but could be an associate lawyer or even a partner who does great work, but really takes advantage of a fixed salary system to do the least she possibly can, and you know, isn't as concerned about the money as she might be, or as others are. Sorry. So those are the 6 personas. Now, what if you have a persona who's not on the list? And here's another pitch I want to make for an objective compensation system, which is it can be really good for self-selection. If you've got to carry an overhead load in a firm, and you know, then you make what you make after you've covered that nut. If you're not producing a whole lot, it doesn't take too long for people to start looking around and going, is this really the right place for me? So that saves the firm the work of doing that. And it's really important in a mid-sized law firm where you have practicing lawyers as the leaders to minimize your management burden, because it's painful. You know, you're squeezing in that management work on top of a law practice, which is really, really hard. And so, you know, if you have unnecessary work you got to do, if you're spending a lot of time managing your people, then something's going wrong and something's going to give there. So objective compensation system, you know, if you've got somebody who's doesn't do very good work, doesn't work very hard, you know, just struggling for whatever reason, an objective system can take care of about 80% of your problems there. And, you know, that does make it very important that your compensation criteria, how you're compensating people, really reflect the firm performance expectations. So, you know, if somebody gets paid less and that is in line with, well, they, you know, didn't work hard, they didn't work well, the clients didn't like them, the partners didn't like working with them, you know, that then you know, if you've got those in alignment, then that really helps in that respect. And you know, then the people you value most should succeed financially. Now there's you know, always exceptions to that. I mean, my firm had one famously a-hole partner who was very successful financially, and you know, the system did not do its job there, although he did ultimately self-select and went on to a different career path. So I should not say any more or I'll get myself in trouble. Okay, so now let's take a look at each one of these people quickly and how they perform under the different types of compensation systems that we might offer. So this is Horace, again, the founding partner. We've invented some production information for him. Big rainmaker, still managing some clients, working pretty hard, does some management work, has a lot of equity. And let's say we're doing a pro rata overhead here. So bearing 250 in overhead. If you look at him in a lockstep system, everybody just get paid relative to their longevity, he's making a whole bunch of money. You know, so that could be a big issue as we try to sort out a different system. If we apply the objective system and he gets paid for origination, responsible working, if he gets a pro rata overhead, since he's a high producer, he gets the benefit from that. He's making about half of what he was. A proportional system, he pays higher overhead, even less, but he's still making good money. So there's some negotiation to do, but you know, if Horace is going to keep other people around, he's going to have to compromise. Now we look at Atticus. Let's say he originates a little bit, responsible for more, not working about half time probably, has a lot of management time, 15 years equity. So he makes about 300,000 under a lockstep system. In an objective pro rata system, he's going to make a little bit more because his production's a little bit lower. But he still gets a significant raise, little bit of a raise under a proportional system. But still, he gets a little attaboy for some of the, other things that he's doing. But he's compensated pretty well for management here. Julia, again, let's say she's got a large origination, managing a huge caseload, working hard, but she's a 15-year equity level. She's making the same as the other partners who've been there 15 years, even though she's working much harder. She's going to be very unhappy, and a lockstep system is probably not going to stick around. You put her in a pro rata system where she gets a favorable overhead allocation here. She's making $500,000. If it's proportional, it's $430,000. So still a nice raise for her, and ability to say, hey, look, this is what's fair, Julia. We can, so that she can feel like she's fairly compensated. And, why would she get paid more somewhere else based on the same production? And I will talk a little bit more about proportional overhead here in a second. And that's not the only way to slice the overhead pie there. And of course, if they went from 50 to 30% overhead, there would be another 100 grand or so for per lawyer to pass around. Francesca, she's getting a very fat deal given her production here as the lifestyle partner. She's got to give up something if she wants to stay at this firm, something more like 165 to 230, which is what these what the objective system would give her. Probably makes more sense in her case. Marvin, I looked at what he might make as a salaried associate, about 100,000, even though he's working very hard. He doesn't get any equity, of course, because he's not a partner. On a objective system, he's going to get a huge raise here. So you're probably going to keep Marvin pretty happy under either one of these systems. And then finally, we've got Glenda. She's producing relatively, as a paralegal, a couple 100,000 in revenue a year, paid 70, which is probably not far off, what she should be paid. A pro rata overhead allocation obviously doesn't work there. If she has to bear the same overhead as the lawyers, a proportional overhead system works better and puts her at about where she is now. So, she's not the most important person to accommodate, but, I think you're in the ballpark for her with an objective system. Let's just really quickly slice these a different way and show everybody under lockstep and then everybody under the proportional systems. So you can see again with the lockstep, the big issue is Atticus making way more money, or Horace making way more money than everybody else. Atticus, Julia, and Francesca making the same amount, even though their production is very different. And then Marvin and Glenda completely separated from the economics of their specific practices. So there's trouble in this system for this firm. And then if we look at pro rata overhead, you can see it levels things out quite a lot between people, which is, probably much more healthy in a firm. I mean, that's how things tended to work out in my firms, that everybody wound up being a rainmaker. Everybody wound up making not the same amount of money, but much more even than they would have in other ways of dividing things. So, you've got obviously a huge issue with Glenda. She can't bear that level of overhead. You'd have to make some accommodation there. And Marvin, Francesca, there's things to be negotiated between people, but you've got a good, solid, rational basis to do that. And then here's the proportionate overhead system. And here's where I wanted to talk about, other things that you can do there that I've seen. Some firms will have different overhead allocations by class of person. So partners get a certain level of overhead, associates get a certain level of overhead, and paralegals get a different level of overhead. Or you could try to allocate it specifically to the person. You have a 0.4 of a secretary, so you get allocated so much from there. Your office is this big, so you get so much from that. I really don't like that system because I think it's very divisive. I think, so you start niggling over little bits of overhead when you really should be picking up your head and going, how do I generate revenue at that point? And it's also just a lot of work and expensive to keep track of overhead and allocate it to that level. So, I think there's, for most firms, some sort of compromise makes sense. Either just allocate it proportionate to revenue, allocate it by class, something along those lines. Okay, so that's, a quick run through those examples of how to, how to set up an objective system. And, I guess as I'm thinking about, how do you pull all of this together and how do you make this work in your firm? I just want to emphasize, going back to the slide about how much money you're giving up based on having poor economics in your firm. If you look at your performance and see that, then, just bear in mind that the clock is ticking, that you've only got so many years, and I'll tell you, it goes really fast, to earn money and, create a nest egg for yourself and get what you want out of your practice. If you're spending a lot of that on overhead and on inefficiency, then, it doesn't make sense to only chase revenue at that point, because the revenue you have to chase every day. If you get your overhead in line, that's, you fix it once, it's fixed for good, and you can get a lot of benefit over time from setting up those good practices. If you think that an objective system could help your firm, start having respectful conversations with people about it, about the why of this and how it can, help create that trust and accountability and a feeling of fairness that you want. And it allows you to align on those values and the culture that you want, so that you can, allow everybody to focus on their own practices and serving their clients, which is really what everybody wants to do. Then you can, there's always a negotiation about what the specific compensation factors are and the weight. We had a very strong managing partner early on in my firm, so strangely, the compensation factors tended to favor what he was looking for. but that, worked itself out over time as, different people came to different positions, and it still evolves. But it's, much easier to have those conversations on a principled basis than every year when the compensation committee comes out with its recommendations. You've got to have that fight then. That creates a lot of difficulty and distrust. And then just get on with it. 2025 is coming right up. See if you can get something set up for next year, and start doing things differently, because there's so much room for law firms to be better on the financial side of things. And I know there's a lot of inertia that you all feel, and but again, you only get to go through this once, so take the hard steps and make it happen. And remember again that the clock is ticking. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. I see that we have a couple of questions. Okay, so I'll open these up and go through them. So Jacqueline asks, I'm curious to know the data source for what is considered average versus top performing overhead numbers. That's a great question. It is really hard to get good data sources in the for law firm financial performance. That's held pretty closely to the vest. And there's a study that was done a few years ago that we will put in the email. I'm blanking on the source of it. I don't love the data, but I've had a lot of conversations with partners who validate it on an anecdotal basis. So I think it's about right. And I will look at things like staff ratios, and that seems to validate it as well. If you've got more staff than lawyers in your firm, you're probably looking at an overhead percentage around 50%. So when we send out the follow-up, we'll have the detailed information on that. We just have someone asking, are the slides available? Yes, you will receive the slides and some other information I'll talk about in just a minute. And Jacqueline, again, have you seen firms succeed with a primarily objective system, with a small amount of subjective, such as 95 objective? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to be rigid about this. Again, it's really about tying the compensation back to people's values and having them feel like they don't have to worry about some arbitrary decision having a significant impact on their compensation. And if people agree that 5% is great in terms of a subjective pool, and we trust the people who are passing it around, that can actually be a help, because any fully objective system that you put together can be pretty arbitrary and it will be arbitrary in certain circumstances where it's like, hey, wait a minute, I did great things this year, and for whatever reason the numbers didn't work. It's good if your culture and your system have some flexibility to deal with that. When we, one thing my firm did is, the associates were not expected to take the risk of collection, for one thing. So there would be a salary and then a bonus component, which was based on the production numbers. And there always was wiggle room there. And, there almost always was a, oh gosh, we need to have a Christmas bonus for nothing kind of way that worked. So it's good to humanize this, as well as, to have an objective backbone to it. Okay, so Richard asks, are you suggesting that a top performing law firm should have 30% in operating expenses? And can you define operating expenses again? The answer is yes. That is if you do not include either the biller's compensation in the operating expenses, then you should be able to achieve 30%. So that's that's things like your staff expense. It's things like your rent, your building expense, technology, all of those type of expenses. But the people you count the compensation of the people who actually do the work in the profit side of it, not in the expense side. And it sounds like you might be asking that a little bit incredulously, but again, I've seen it accomplished not just in my firm. There actually were a few spin-off firms from my firm that used the same model that achieved even lower levels. And it's just a matter of having a mindset of low overhead and using technology pretty well. And then we have an anonymous attendee asking, what are your techniques for dealing with unrealistic expectations among junior attorneys and senior ones for that matter? Well, I think it's, as you saw, there were 6 pillars of a top performing firm. There's a cultural and an educational component to this that, that you want people who value that they are compensated fairly based on the work that they do. I actually fell for the opposite one time. When I first came to Boise, I took an offer with the firm that made me too good to be true offer up front. And I learned 2 years later why, because the partners were not making any money. And so there was no future in that firm. And that was one of the blowups that I experienced, because that was essentially a problem for the whole office. So, it's a matter of, I think, treating people like adults and saying, here are the numbers. Here's what you earn as a, as a young lawyer. Here's what you produce. You may have to subsidize those salaries a little bit at the front end because of what's happened with associate salaries, but having people understand that and see the real numbers, I think, is really helpful. And let's see, Richard, thanks for your comment there. So let's see, someone is saying, are you advocating full transparency of the P&L to everyone? I would say not the P&L, but I think I would say full transparency as to their personal production. So if you have a a review with an associate, say, it's got their numbers on it. Here's how much you billed. You may have, here's how much we collected out of that as well. And, maybe there's an adjustment if there are too many write-downs as far as that. But, from day one, what you're really trying to do is educate a partner in that, and, build somebody up so they will be a partner one day, that they're going to feel incented to bring in their own clients because they know they get compensated for that. They're going to be incented to work hard, and if they or to stick around because they value the flexibility that a system like this can give. All righty. So that is the last question on that I see on here. So let's see, did I miss any? I don't think so. Just checking really quick to make sure I answered all the questions. I believe I did. All right, thanks everybody for joining. We are right at the hour. So thanks all. And so you're going to receive an email now with more resources. It's going to have the slides and the recording from the webinar. It's going to include the financial report card we discussed. There's also a law firm compensation calculator that's included in that. The first 3 chapters of an ebook that I'm writing called The Linchpin, which kind of tell the story of a law firm that's going through this transformation story. And then we have a big Q&A in the last compensation webinar. So that's also included, has some other questions and answers you might find interesting. Okay, so thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.